On top of all the new objects in the Origin of Pain DLC for Trials Evo, we also have some new tools to help track builders step up their game. These tools all build upon existing skills. If you're not already comfortable with the concepts of events, filters, operators, and data sources, you'll need to go back and learn those first before moving on to these new tools. Of the 13 new tools, 7 of them are vector tools, and those are what we'll be discussing in this video. On the most basic level, the vector tools are used to work with multiple values at once. Many of the vector tools work together, so I'll be jumping around a little. But for now, since the vector tools are all about values, let's start in the data source category. You can see here we have 4 new vector-based data sources. It'll be easiest to explain if we start from the basics. So first, I'll select the basic vector data source, in the menu simply called vector. By default, the vector is set to hold 3 values and labels them X, Y, and Z. This is handy as the vector tools are great for working with the X, Y, and Z coordinates of objects. However, you're not limited to just 3 values. The vector can store anything from 2 all the way up to 1,000 values. The vector size field is how to adjust how many values the vector data source will hold. The downside to going above 3 values is that they cannot be manually adjusted in the data source. As you can see, with a value of 4 or above in the vector size field, we only get one field to input a value, labeled fill with a value. Whatever value you input here will be the base value of every value in your vector. So how do you change each value individually? That's where the set vector event comes into play. So let's jump on over to events. The set vector event is basically the same as the set value event, only it's used for setting the values in a vector. Let's take a look at those properties to see what I mean. In the type slider, we have the same value adjustments we see in the set value event. These determine how the event will adjust the values already in the vector data source. With the 3 size vector checkbox checked, you have X, Y, and Z values you can adjust all at once. Set your vector data source as the event target, and it'll input these 3 values into the X, Y, and Z values there. With 3 size vector unchecked, you can only adjust one value at a time, but this is what we're interested in at the moment. Unchecked, the options below change from X, Y, and Z values to index and value. The index is the value within the vector that'll be changed. Say for example, your vector is set to hold 6 values. Now imagine that each value resides in a box within the vector data source. Each box is an index. Index 0 is the first box, 1 is the second, 2 is the third, and so on. Now, back in our set vector event, the value is of course the number it will use to adjust the target index in the vector. Now let's go back to data sources and look at another tool that uses these same basic principles, the get vector data source. This tool is pretty simple. Its only purpose is to extract a single value from any of the vector-based data sources. It only has 2 options in the properties. Select vector, of course, chooses which vector data source it will extract the value from, and select index is how you choose which value it'll take. Say for example, you have a vector holding a number of values, and you want to use the 5th value as your primary score. You can't use the vector as your primary score target because it won't know which value to use. So you grab a get vector data source, point it towards your vector, and set the index to 4. Now the get vector data source is holding the value you want, and you can set it as your primary score target. Next, let's spawn a vector object info data source. This one is really handy. For anybody who does stuff like using an object position event to follow an object, this just made your job a little easier. The vector object info data source is basically the same as the object info data source, only as you may have guessed, it holds all 3 axis values instead of just 1. There are a few less options in the type because this tool only pulls values for properties that use an X, Y, and Z value. So things like driving line distance or speed are excluded. But here's the best part. As previously stated, this is a great tool to use with the object position event, and that's because the OPE knows which values are which. So instead of pointing the X, Y, and Z coordinates in the OPE to 3 different object info data sources, we can point them all to this one data source, saving a few steps when setting up something like an object follow animation. Finally, in the data sources, we have the curve vector data source, and perhaps by now you can guess what this one does. It of course is the same as the normal curve data source, only creating a curve for multiple values at once. The only options that differ from the normal curve data source are the start and end values. We don't have the option here to manually input start and end values, so each needs to use one of the other vector data sources as a value target. Again, this is really nice for making animation easier. Say for example, you're animating an object from point A to point B. Using the original toolset, this would require 3 curve and 6 object info data sources, 9 data sources total. Now, to get the exact same thing, you need only 1 curve vector and 2 vector object info data sources. Only 3, greatly reducing the number of inputs you need to adjust and connections between tools that need to be made. That's it for data sources, but we have 2 more vector tools to check out, and they're both operators. The operators are of course all about math, and unfortunately I don't have the time in this video or the math knowledge to get into a detailed math lesson. I'll try to explain the basics of each operator, but fully understanding everything it can do may require a little further reading. First, let's take a look at the vector scalar. The basic idea of the scalar is that it produces one number from the set of numbers in a vector. Let's quickly inspect the properties. First we have type. This allows us to use 1 or 2 vector data sources to get the resulting value. Next is operation. This of course determines how the value is calculated. The first option, length, uses an equation to calculate the length of the vector. Size is simply how many values the vector holds. Min pulls the smallest value from the vector, and of course max takes the largest. And finally, mean is the average of all the values in the vector. Vector operand is how you choose the vector that you're getting values from, and depending on how you set the type, you either have 1 or 2 operands to choose. Finally, we have the vector operator. This one has many options, some of which are fairly advanced in the mathematics they use. But even if you aren't a math whiz, this can still be a useful tool, so let's check it out. The purpose of the vector operator is to use 1 or more vectors to create a new vector. Let's open up those properties and take a closer look. As usual, our first choice is type, or as is stated here, input type. In this case, the input type mainly determines how many vectors you're working with. By default, it's set to 2. N vectors lets you use as many vectors as you want. Vector and value will use a single value to alter the values in the vector. And finally, the vector type will alter the values in a single vector. As you may have noticed, all the following options change depending on the type. So instead of detailing every individual option, I'll just give the overall idea of each. First we have operation. This decides how the operator will use the various input types to calculate the new vector values. These range from simple addition all the way up to some more advanced mathematics that I'm willing to admit I'm not qualified to teach. The next 1 or 2 options are how you choose your vectors. For most types, this will involve selecting 1 or more vector-based data sources as value targets. But with the vector and value type, you also get a field to manually enter a single value or use a single value data source as a value target. And there you go. That's the basics of working with vectors. I know to the less mathematically minded, this can be confusing at first. Trust me, I was there myself the first time I looked at these new tools. But once I figured out how to use them, I had discovered a few new favorite tools. Hopefully, I've given you enough information to learn to love the vectors like I have. If not, stop by the forums at redlynx.com. There are some really helpful players there who are much smarter than I am when it comes to this math stuff.